Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. Two new movies are opening in theaters this weekend. Warner Bros. Discovery's and DC Studios movie The Flash, starring Ezra Miller, and Disney Pixar's latest animated movie, Elemental. I released a video in May talking about The Flash, and I'll go over some updates regarding my previous projections for the movie. I'll also be showing my projections for Elemental. Neither of these movies have been predicted by the media to have good domestic opening weekend box office revenue, which is not going to work in either movie's favor. I'll begin with The Flash. I have revised my projections for the movie following the projections that I made in a video that I had released on May 27th. As it turns out, reports of the movie's production budget were revised upwards to $220 million, which is $20 million more than I had previously reported. Naturally, that means that its break-even point is likely more than I had originally estimated. If I multiply the updated production budget by 2.5 to estimate the mid-range break-even point, I get a value of $550 million. To account for the 50% of gross ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget. To estimate the upper range break-even point, I'll multiply the production budget by 3 to get a value of $660 million in the event that the studio spent even more to market the movie. To gain some perspective on how much that break-even point range is, we'll look at this chart that shows how well the previous 12 DCEU movies have performed at the box office, along with their respective estimated break-even point ranges. And we can see that the most recent 5 DCEU movies have not performed well at all. In fact, the last one that was financially successful was 2019's Shazam, because even though it only earned $363.6 million at the global box office, it had a very small production budget, which allowed it to have a very low break-even point. However, Wonder Woman 1984, The Suicide Squad, and Black Adam each had very high break-even points that were all slightly lower than the one for The Flash, which none of their respective global box office earnings were able to overcome. Those movies' failures, as well as the massive box office failure of the most recent DCEU film that opened earlier this year, Shazam! Fury of the Gods, whose flop was made even worse due to it having a much lower break-even point, doesn't actually bode well for The Flash. The one DCEU movie whose break-even point range is the nearest to The Flash is the very first DCEU movie, 2013's Man of Steel, which earned $668 million. In other words, The Flash needs to do at least as well as Man of Steel to firmly establish that it has broken even. But can it do that? The most recent prediction for how much money The Flash will earn domestically during its opening weekend is $70 million, which is the same estimate that I had used for the video that I had released on May 27th. But I have decided to use a more statistically aligned range of average weekly drops in box office than the 40 to 30% range that I have typically been using. And to do that, I calculated a histogram and normal distribution for the average weekly drops in box office experienced by the previous 12 DCEU films, as illustrated in the chart that you are now looking at. The peak of the normal distribution is the average weekly drop for all 12 DCEU movies, which is 39.15%. Where the horizontal dashed line intersects the normal distribution curve corresponds to one standard deviation below the average weekly drop for all 12 movies, and one standard deviation above. For any normal distribution curve, the range of values that are between one standard deviation above and below the average value have around a 68% probability of occurring, while the values that are between 1 and 2 standard deviations away only have a 27% probability of occurring, and anything beyond 2 standard deviations only has a 5% likelihood of occurring. So the range of average weekly drops that I will examine are those that are up to 1 standard deviation away from the overall average for all 12 movies, and those values are at 29.94% and 48.36%. Something to notice here is that when we look at how many of the DCEU movies have average weekly drops that fall within one standard deviation of the average for all 12 movies, we find a total of 8 movies, which is 66% of all of the DCEU movies that have completed their theatrical runs to date. And that lines up quite nicely with how a normal distribution curve is supposed to work. Interestingly, the movie represented by the histogram bar at the far left of the chart is in fact 2018's Aquaman, which unsurprisingly is the highest grossing movie of the DCEU to date. And that position for its average weekly drop of 20.26% is just beyond the second standard deviation, which places it into the 5% probability zone. The second histogram bar from the left represents 2017's Wonder Woman, which is the third highest grossing DCEU film to date. Surprisingly, the second highest grossing DCEU movie to date, 2016's Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, had an average weekly drop in box office of 50.25%, which means that it's represented by the second histogram bar from the right. The first histogram bar from the right represents this year's movie flop, Shazam! Fury of the Gods. Now, while Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice having an average weekly drop in box office of 50.25% may seem counterintuitive, the reason why that film made up for that steep decline in box office is thanks to its low domestic share, which we will be getting into shortly. So when I calculate the possible final domestic box office values for The Flash, using a predicted opening weekend box office of $70 million, and average weekly drops of 48.36%, 39.15%, and 29.94%, I get values of around $145 million, $175 million, and $234 million, respectively. And the reason that the upper and lower values aren't the same distance from the middle value is because the relationship between the final box office value and the average weekly drops is not linear. The lower the average weekly drop, the greater the distance between the successive values. But to project the possible global box office for The Flash, we also have to consider the possible domestic share for the movie. So I decided to follow a similar approach as I had done for the average weekly drops by calculating a histogram and normal distribution for the domestic shares of the 12 preceding DCEU movies, as shown in the next chart. While the average for the domestic shares is nearly exactly the same as the average weekly drop for the 12 DCEU movies, the standard deviation is smaller because the domestic shares are more concentrated. So with an average domestic share for all 12 movies of 39.02%, the lower percentage that's one standard deviation below the average is 32.42%, and the percentage that's one standard deviation above the average is at 45.63%. As points of interest, the histogram bar that's furthest to the left represents 2 movies, 2018's Aquaman, which isn't surprising, and 2020's Wonder Woman 1984, which may seem surprising given that that movie flopped, but that's due primarily to it having the lowest opening weekend box office for any DCEU movie, and it wasn't liked by moviegoers. And as I had talked about earlier, even though 2016's Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice had a 50.25% average weekly drop in box office, it had a 37.87% domestic share, which is represented in the histogram chart by the fourth bar from the left, and is what allowed the movie to become the second highest grossing DCEU movie to date. Also somewhat counterintuitive on this chart is the histogram bar that's furthest to the right, which represents 2017's Wonder Woman, whose domestic share was 50.45%. But thanks to its incredibly low average weekly drops in box office, it's the third highest grossing DCEU movie. Since it's difficult to know where the domestic share for The Flash is going to land, I'm using a chart that shows a range of domestic share points between 32.45% and 45.63%, which are the domestic shares that are one standard deviation away from the average for the 12 movies of 39.02%. The green horizontal line represents the estimated mid-range break-even point of $550 million, while the horizontal magenta line represents the estimated upper range break-even point of $660 million. The blue curve represents the possible final global box office values based on the final domestic box office projected from the average weekly drops that are one standard deviation above the overall average weekly drop. The red curve represents the final global box office that's based on the final domestic box office projected from the overall average weekly drops in box office. And the highlighted white diamond point in the middle of the red curve represents the possible final global box office value that was projected by using both the overall average weekly drops and the overall average domestic share. And that value is $458 million, using an average weekly drop of 39.15% and an average domestic share of 39.02%. The yellow curve above, of course, represents the possible final global box office values projected by using the average weekly drops that are one standard deviation below the overall average weekly drop. The two most extreme points on the chart are the upper leftmost point on the yellow curve and the lower rightmost point on the blue curve, which are less likely than the area surrounding the central point at $458 million along the red curve. So I will calculate the projected final global box office range for The Flash as the midway points between the central point and the two extremes, and that range works out to $388 million to $589 million. So there is a possibility that The Flash could break even, but it's a rather slim chance. There's much higher likelihood from what I can see that the movie will flop. Now, the other movie that's opening, the Disney Pixar animated movie Elemental, has a rather low predicted domestic opening weekend box office of around $35 million. Historically, Pixar movies have sometimes had low opening weekends, but with low average weekend drops that allowed them to end up breaking even in the end. But over the years, the average Pixar movie weekly drop in box office has been steadily rising as highlighted by the orange trend line in this chart. As I did with The Flash, I created a histogram and normal distribution for Pixar movies' average weekly drops in box office, minus the movies that weren't released in theaters domestically since they lack the necessary data. So for the Pixar movies that can be analyzed, the overall average weekly drop for them is around 28.4%, which is rather good, but the standard deviation is over 9%, which is similar to the standard deviation for the DCEU average weekly drops. The outlier on the far right-hand side of the chart represents the 2020 Pixar movie Onward and has an average weekly drop in box office of over 63%. Which is more than 3.6 times the standard deviation away from the average. The second furthest outlier on the right-hand side at 42.75% is for last year's flop of a movie, Lightyear, and between it and Onward, they have the largest average weekly drops in box office for all Pixar animated movies, and are also Pixar's two most recent movies that were released in theaters domestically. This implies that Elemental could also end up having a much higher than average weekly drop in box office. But I will use the range defined by the points that are one standard deviation away from the overall average weekly drop. And those points are at 18.73% and 38.07%. So by using these two average weekly drops along with the overall average weekly drop to project the potential final domestic box office for Elemental yields the following values: $92 million, $123 million, and $184 million. And none of these values are all that impressive. Carrying out a similar histogram and normal distribution for the historic Pixar movies' domestic shares yields the following chart. The average domestic share for all Pixar movies that had a domestic box office release is 42.67%, and its standard deviation is around 7%. So the range of possible domestic shares that I will examine for Elemental corresponds to the values located one standard deviation away from the average, and those values are at 35.68% and 49.66%. Using the group of final domestic box office values that I projected along with this range of domestic shares reveals the following range of possible final global box office values for the movie as shown in this chart. The The centermost projected final global box office value that's highlighted by the white diamond occurs at the overall average weekly drop in box office for all domestically released Pixar movies, as well as the overall average domestic share. And that value is at $288 million. By taking the midpoints between the central value and the two extreme values located at the upper left-hand point of the yellow curve and the lower right-hand point along the blue curve, yields the following projected range of final global box office for Elemental, which is between $237 million and $402 million. And given that the movie's production budget is $200 million, if we multiply that by 2.5 to get its approximate break-even point, since Disney hasn't marketed the movie that much, we get a value of around $500 million. So the likelihood that Elemental is going to break even is even lower than the likelihood of The Flash breaking even. In other words, it is more than likely going to flop in theaters. The fact of the matter is this: the mixed-race relationship theme as the primary plot for the movie is nothing new. One of the best movies made during the 1960s was the 1967 movie Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, starring the late Sidney Poitier, who only died last year, as well as the late Katharine Hepburn, the late Spencer Tracy, the late Isabel Sanford, which was long before she became known for her starring role in the 1970 sitcom The Jeffersons, and many others. Then there's also the 2002 romantic comedy My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which was enormously popular. There was also a mixed race combined with a mixed religion subplot in the 1971 musical Fiddler on the Roof. Consequently, I'm not impressed by The Flash or with Elemental, and it doesn't look like all that many people are either. So we'll have to wait a few days to see how well these movies perform this weekend, which will allow me to refine my projections for the movies. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to see more of our videos in the future and help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.